Good evening. I have a great idea for a new kind of college. No technology. I think it would be highly marketable. I think there are at least 2,000 parents who would like to see their students, their children come to such a place. So if I have any takers who would like to support such an endeavor, I'll be doing that somewhere in Alaska in the next year. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here tonight. I think you're going to be highly rewarded. And I intend to learn a lot tonight. I was a student, as were many of us here tonight, of Ira Zepp. And I always felt like I could never learn enough from him. I believe there are a number of teachers here tonight. We have teachers? Great. Wonderful. Look at all the teachers. Well, Ira was a teacher. And we hope that what you learn tonight you can take to your classrooms and incorporate in your own life of the mind. Our speaker tonight is not a stranger to this stage. He served on the board of directors of Common Ground on the Hill for a number of years. He still serves in the capacity of advisor on our advisory board. He's no stranger to this stage. He went to college here, Western Maryland College, graduated in 1967, went to Drew Theological Seminary, and then on to Chicago, University of Chicago, where he worked with some of the great theologians of the day, and then taught at University of Colorado and Princeton, and now we find him at Harvard. He did pretty good for a guy from Western Maryland College. A lot of people have. David Carrasco is a Mexican-American historian of religions, working on the topics of religious experience, sacred cities, and the Latino diaspora. His most recent book is The Aztecs, a very short introduction, on Oxford University Press, and he teaches in the Harvard Divinity School and the Department of Anthropology. He holds the Neil Rudenstein Chair of Latin American Studies at Harvard. I have to tell you, one night I was dreaming, and I thought, David, I'm hearing David in this dream. And I woke up and realized I'd left the television on, and there he was on In Search Of. This was in 1982. He's been at this a long time. In 2004, he was awarded the Mexican Order of the Aztec Eagle, the highest honor Mexico gives to a foreign national. In 2011, he was elected into the Academia Mexicana de la Historia for his outstanding contributions to understanding the history of religions in Mexico. Make welcome David Carrasco.
Thank you all for your patience tonight as we have finally put in place a presentation that I've spent the last month putting together in honor of my teacher and friend, Ira Gilbert Zepp, Jr. I want to thank Common Ground on the Hill for this invitation. I want to thank especially Walt Michael, who not only has done such a wonderful job founding and directing Common Ground, but also allowed me to come here to give this presentation. He also took pictures earlier this week of Ellen Elms's mural, which is up in the library, which I'm using in the PowerPoint presentation so that you can get a richer sense of who Ira Zepp was, not only to me, but to many other people. I also want to thank Charles Collier, who helped me think through this presentation. And when I realized that I didn't have some of Ira's books, Charlie put his books in the mail to me, and I've been able to work through them over the last 2 weeks. And I brought them back here for Charlie, and I've got them up here on the stage because I want you to get a sense of Ira Zepp, not only as a minister and as a teacher, but as a great intellectual. It's certainly an honor for me to be on this stage on the first night of Common Ground, to share my stories and deep admiration and love and gratitude for the life and teachings of Ira Gilbert Zepp, someone who William Tribby called a compassionate, incomparable man. A compassionate, incomparable man. Let me be quick to say that there are many others here who knew Ira, who studied with him, who worked with him, who benefited by their association and friendship with him. So there's many views of Ira Zepp tonight. And I ask your indulgence as I give you a summary presentation of my Ira Zepp. I just want to share with you and tell you some of this appreciation. Since we're talking about this notion of the beloved community and the notion of community, let me just ask some of you in the audience, how many of you knew Ira Zepp? Take a look around. Let's see. Many of you knew Ira Zepp, so it looks about half of you knew Ira Zepp. How many of you took classes with Ira Zepp? The number goes down, but there's still a number of people who benefited by taking courses with this marvelous man. In the early years of his life at this college, he used to serve communion here in Little Baker Chapel. How many of you had a chance to receive communion from Ira Zepp? Just a few of us had a chance to do that. How many of you ever had a chance to pray with Ira Zepp? I had a chance to pray with Ira Zepp. Let me ask you, how many of you went and told him your secrets? Many hands will go up. Ira Zepp heard a lot of secrets, and he kept those secrets. And so I'm just trying to, here at the beginning, show some of you who'd never met him a sense of how important he was to us and how he was important to us. And it's very important for me to also acknowledge that I had a chance today to meet with the Search for Common Ground class, and I got to meet a number of the students who are here from China, from Westminster, from Carroll County, from other places. And many of them are teachers, and it's to those teachers I especially want to talk tonight, and I have you very much in my mind. And so there are many of us here who knew him, but also many who never knew him. Certainly it's very important to think of Ira in terms of his family. Here you see another image from Ellen Elms's mural. If you haven't had a chance, please go up into the library and you can see this incredible mural that Ellen Elms painted. And is there any way to bring the lights down a little bit up here so that people can really see these incredible images? Now I want to draw attention to the fact that we're at a college on the hill. Quite often over the years, people don't even refer to it as the college. They refer to it as being on the hill. And this is important in my thinking about Ira Zepp. As a matter of fact, you know, the magazine is called The Hill. And it seems to me that it's very important to think about Ira Zepp in terms of the following fact. He spent his entire academic teaching and professional life at this college on this hill. And I think that's important to understand the man and his commitments and what it was that he was about. I think there's some secret reason that he spent his entire academic career on this hill. You know, he could have gone up the ladder of academia. He had job offers to go to other universities. He could have left this hill and this college and gone into Baltimore, New York City, Chicago, other places that were interested in him. But he decided that not only did he go to undergraduate school here, not only was he the dean of the chapel and a professor here, but this is where he lived his life. There was some reason that he stayed here, and I want to come back to that later. We know there's a mural of his life. There's the Ira and Mary Zepp Center for Nonviolence and Peace here. There's the lectureship, and of course there's a common ground. And all of these things are very important and point me to this notion of the hill. So let me begin with a story that has to do with the title of my talk, Ira Zepp and the Search for the Beloved Community. I talked about this earlier. So a couple years ago, I was invited to the University of Texas and Pan American down in the valley, down near the Rio Grande. It's one of the poorest of the University of Texas campuses, and I was invited to give their big once a year lecture. They were used to having very big names come down there, much bigger than me. The year before, Madeleine Albright gave the lecture. This is a university that is highly populated with Mexican Americans, and so this time, they were hoping that Eva Longoria would be invited or Jennifer Lopez, but they got me, and so I went down there, and I really wanted to do a good job, especially for the Mexican American students. I wanted to come through for them. So I worked very hard in the presentation of my lecture, also a PowerPoint. I worked for weeks. I built it up. I used stories from my own life. I used stories from the history of Mexico and the history of Mexican Americans. And as part of the time that I spent there before the lecture, they had a dinner, and they asked me to come to this dinner with the top 45 Mexican American students at the university. I was to go there as an example of how a Mexican American could, in a sense, use their education and their learning in order to do something very significant in the world of academia. So I went to this dinner, thinking that the dinner was the dinner right before the lecture. And as I sat down at the table, at the head table there with the students, the provost leaned over to me and he said, look, in 15 minutes you're going to stand up and give the lecture. And I said, well, I thought the lecture was after the dinner. He said, well, no, you're going to give that other lecture. And I said, the other lecture, let's see. My agent who had arranged this had never told me about the other lecture. So I said, the other lecture? And he said, yeah, the one about, how you've used your own educational experiences and how it can benefit these students more directly. And I said, oh, yeah, that lecture. I said, that lecture. So now I had 12 minutes, and I started, what am I going to talk about? What am I going to do? And I started to get a piece of paper, and I started to take some notes. What am I going to do? Now it's 10 minutes, and eating our little salad and talking to the students. I decided I'm going to interview the students as quickly as I can to see if somehow I'll get an idea. And so I started interviewing the students, where are you from, what do you study, and so forth. And as we went around the table, with about 4 minutes to go, an idea came to me. And the idea came to me in the form of a phrase that comes out of Zen Buddhism. And the phrase is simply, when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. When the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And suddenly tumbling through my mind were 4 experiences that I'd had in my life, that fulfilled that statement, where I was ready and the teacher appeared. Now, when you're to say that when the student is ready, it doesn't mean the student is prepared. Student may be in chaos. Student may be confused. Student may be rebellion, but they're ready, they're open for something. And I went on to give this lecture in this 20 minutes before I then went in to give the other lecture, off the cuff. And I talked about 4 of my teachers. I talked about Toni Morrison, the African-American novelist who had befriended me and taught me some very important things while I was at Princeton. I talked about Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, the great excavator of the Aztec Great Temple in Mexico City, who had taught me how important it is to collaborate. And I talked about Judith Sherman, and Judith Sherman was this Holocaust survivor who had come to my classes when I was teaching at Princeton and befriended me and, in a sense, taught me about the Holocaust, even though I was trying to teach about the Holocaust at Princeton. But I started the whole story off by talking about Ira Zepp. And I got through the talk fine, went in, gave the other lecture. That also went well. When I got back to Harvard, the provost wrote to my agent and said, Carrasco's visit went fine. The public lecture that he gave, that really was good. But that thing he did at dinner, that was fantastic. That was the best thing of the whole visit. And so what I want to do is I want to tell you what I said about Ira Zepp on that particular night when I was there in that situation. I want to tell you how I came to know Ira Zepp. I was a freshman here, 1963. And I was in the dormitory on the day that John F. Kennedy was assassinated. And the word came into the dormitory, and everybody was confused. We didn't know if Kennedy was yet dead. And people were running around, didn't know what to do. And I decided, I'd been raised in the Methodist Church, I decided that, well, maybe I could pray a prayer. So I came over to the Big Baker Chapel to say a prayer, thinking that there'd be all kinds of students in there praying. And I got inside the chapel, and I looked around, and there wasn't a single student in the chapel. But I sat down, and I started to pray. And down at the end of the chapel, here you see the doorway, the door opened. The door opened for me. And out stepped Ira Zepp, who I hadn't met. And he looked around to see if there were any takers. And he saw me, and he said, if you'd like to come down and talk, my door is open. So I thought about it a little bit, and I decided to go down through that open door. And when I got inside, I asked Ira Zepp, I sat in my chair, he sat in his chair, and I said to him that 17-year-old question. I said, how could God let something like this happen? How could God allow this type of assassination to take place? And he leaned back in his chair the way he is in this picture, and he said to me, he said, you know, when I was a boy living over here in rural Maryland, every Saturday night there was a radio show. It was called The Shadow. He said, and there was this line that they would always say at the beginning and end of the program. And the line was, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The shadow knows. And Zepp said to me, you know, I don't think this is about what God did. This is about the evil that lurks in the hearts of men. And then he said to me, he said, what you and I have to do in our lives is we've got to look into other parts of people's heart to see what's lurking there. The good stuff, the love, the caring, the friendship. And we have to learn how to nurture that. We have to nurture these other things that are lurking in the hearts of men and women, and that's what our education should really be about. So that began my relationship with Ira Zepp, and we became friends, and we worked together, and we talked together for the next 40 years, up until the week that he passed away. And that's the way Ira Zepp first came to me. Now, what happened was that if you look again at this slide, because this is my second point. The first point was about the hill. What I notice in this slide is what's behind Ira Zepp. And I want to draw attention to the library. I want to draw attention to his library. And I want to take you into this library to show you what's there, especially for these teachers who are here, so you can learn how to take your libraries very seriously. Because what he shared with us was an educated heart. You know, he was a thinker. As a matter of fact, as I was preparing for this and I was talking to Charlie Collier, Charlie told me, he said, look, before Ira passed away, he came up and gave me part of his library. And I said, Charlie, take a picture and send it to me. And Charlie sent me this picture of Ira Zepp's library. So this whole question of the hill is important, but I also want you to realize that in order to understand this person, how seriously he was taking this notion of the library. Now, during the last year of his life, as he was dying of heart failure, and it's all hard to believe how someone like Ira Zepp could die of heart failure because he had so much heart. He told me that he had written part of a book that was his statement about what it was to be a teacher. It was a credo. And I decided that the way I would help him, in a sense, pass away, was to spend time with him finishing that book. And so I went to his house many mornings, and we went through the book, and I insisted that he do something that he didn't want to do. I insisted that he write an autobiographical section of the book. And those of you who knew Ira Zepp, you knew he was just too humble. He didn't want to write an autobiography. But I insisted, he resisted, I insisted, and he relented. And he wrote an 18-page autobiography that's in this book. And I want to tell you how the book begins. This book is called The Pedagogy of the Heart, a Teacher's Credo, because it's in this book that you begin to see the origins of this notion of the beloved community, this notion of the beloved community. What he tells you is that as a young boy in rural Maryland, living in a very poor family, he worked in a stockroom at a store. And then every day at lunch, he'd have his sandwich, his soda pop, and there were some books lying around. And he would go over and pick out these books. And he would read the books during the lunchtime. And here is what he says about his first encounter with these kinds of books. There one could find the bestsellers making the rounds in the 40s, including the popular Samuel Schellenberger's Captain from Castile, Elizabeth Gouge's Green Dolphin Street, and Agnes Lumbold's Bishop's Mantle. Others were more spiritual and had moral depth, and they attracted me. Among these were Richard Wright's Black Boy, Rabbi Liebman's biography, A Living Spirit, and a winner of the National Book Award, Richard Llewellyn's How Green Was My Valley. That I picked this last book from the shelf may have been simply pure coincidence or the providence of God. Probably both, although I opt for the latter. I never read a book more quickly or more intensely. Something in it went straight to my heart. Something in it went straight to my heart. Now, what happens in this book, how many of you ever read How Green Was My Valley? Got to read How Green Was My Valley. So what happens in Green Valley, it takes place in a Welsh mining town. And the miners are being oppressed by the mine. And the people start to stir up and they want to organize themselves. They want to protest the conditions. And there's a minister there in the town. And the minister, he begins to side with the miners who want to not only pray, but they want to picket. And not only want to pray, which they do want to do, and he wants them to do, but they want to organize. And other people come and they criticize the minister. And the minister comes up and he says, my business is anything that comes between the Spirit of God and people. They got to pray and they got to organize. And what Zepp goes on to say is that this became the origins of his own search for social justice. He says, I saw many parallels between what was going on in that book and what it was like for me to grow up here in Maryland. He said, because I grew up on a tenant farm during the Great Depression. In our house, we had no running water. There was only electricity in 2 rooms. But up there on the hill was a big house, and on that big house, on that hill, there was a mansion. It was glowing with electricity. And Zepp says he remembers looking up the hill, and this insight came to him from his experience in the library and looking up the hill. He said, consequently, to this day, I never see the world through eyes of those who have made it. Rather, I view the world, public policy, political parties, and bloviating talking heads on TV through the muscle, sweat, and tears expended by my mother and father in the 1930s. And he says, after that experience of reading that book, all of my studies gravitated toward ethics and justice. Now, Zepp went on reading, and a second book came to play a fundamental role in his library. And that's this book, this particular book by Melvin Herskovits, called Man and His Works, Comparative Anthropology. And what happened here when Zepp read this book, by the way, Herskovits, who was not African-American, became the first person in American academia to make African-American studies very important in universities in the 1940s and 50s. So here's Zepp running across this book, and he says, reading this book, which is about comparative cultures, something that Earl Griswold brought to this campus, that is comparative anthropology. Zepp said, quote, in this particular case, it took me, this poor farm boy, to trips into cultures and societies previously unknown to me and enlarge my worldview beyond measure. This later becomes the impotence for him going to India, to Mexico, to Jerusalem. So school teachers, think about this, how important it is for the books that you can give to those students who are ready for teachers to appear. These early library experiences set out 3 themes in his later life and his later work that he followed. First of all, from then on, he was concerned about social justice via organizing. Secondly, he was interested in the multicultural world. And thirdly, he was interested in prayer as access to transcendence. So he goes on to do some more studying. He comes to this college. He goes on to seminary school. And he comes back here in 1963 as the dean of the chapel. I love this photograph of him. And as a matter of fact, the caption to this photograph reads, "Chapel has changed." Chapel has changed at Washington, Maryland College. And here you see him. Now, I love this picture of him, not only the smile, but holding up his hands in this kind of openness. This was Ira Zepp's students, those of you who never met him. Now, not only is he the dean of the chapel, he's writing articles all the time in the Gold Book. Not only is he doing that, he's coaching football. Not only is he doing that, he's bringing to the campus some of the most radical thinkers, as well as bringing some very traditional thinkers and ministers to speak to the students. That is, he brought this spectrum of people here. And here you see him in this kind of academic position. Here's also one of the images. You see him in the cap and gown on the campus. He developed a very powerful friendship with perhaps the most famous chaplain in the country at that time, William Sloane Coffin. William Sloane Coffin was at Yale University. Ira brought him here. He brought the Berrigan brothers here. He brought Malcolm Boyd here. He, in a sense, opened up our world to a wide spectrum of thinking. This is why we came to love him so much, was because not only did he care for us spiritually, he cared for us intellectually. And that combination really opened us up, those of us at that time who were here. Now, he not only does that, but this theme now becomes so important to him, social justice through organizing. While he's here as a professor, the civil rights movement breaks out, and there's this organization in Selma. You know the story of Selma. He goes to Selma. A lot of people in Carroll County, they don't like the fact that the dean of the chapel at Western Maryland College is going to Selma as part of the civil rights movement. I know he went to Selma because I drove him to the meeting with another minister. And then they went to Baltimore and flew to Selma. And he had to do it somewhat on the QT. Not only that, when he came back the next week and was preaching in the chapel, when he stepped up to preach at the chapel, someone had come and pasted Confederate money on the chapel where he was getting ready to give the sermon. And there was criticism of him and his family. They were mistreated in the town. There was the things that happened to the kids in school because of this type of wholesomeness that he was bringing to us. King is assassinated. King was going to come here and speak at the college at Ira Zepp's invitation. So he had started to become familiar with King. King had to cancel because of other commitments, and soon after, King was assassinated, as we all know. He starts to identify with King at that time, and he enters a PhD program to write a thesis about Martin Luther King's, and these are his words, serious intellectual quest for a method to eliminate social evil. There's that word evil again. And what he does now is he says, I want to understand how Martin Luther King organized his civil rights movement intellectually as well as spiritually as a method to try to deal with social evil. So he goes into what I call Martin Luther King's library. He travels to Crozer Seminary, where King went to school. He goes to Morehouse College. He goes to Boston University. And he gets into the archives to read everything he can about King by King to discern his intellectual influences. This is another wonderful image from the mural up there. You see him here with his satchel in front of this building, and there behind him is Martin Luther King. So here's this white boy, white tenant farmer boy, and he's decided to put himself, you see, in contact, deep contact, not just with the public Martin Luther King that everybody knows, but he wants to know what was in the cat's mind, what really shaped this type of mind, He finds incredibly surprising things. He goes into what I call King's Library. He goes to all the schools. He digs into the archives. Check this out. He reads King's term papers. He looks at the syllabi of his courses to see what he was reading. He reads the books that he read. He interviews his teachers, and what he discovers, and this is one of my main points, he discovers that Martin Luther King had a multiracial, multi-ethnic library. Martin Luther King, yes, he came out of the black church, no question about it, absolutely informed everything. But his intellect was also multi-ethnic and multiracial. This is important. This is important for the future of the way we're going to go in this country. George Kelsey, African-American teacher. Martin Luther King was fundamentally influenced by Walter Rauschenbusch, one of the great, white theologians in the country. Martin Luther King studied with read Reinhold Niebuhr. I love this name. George Washington Davis was one of Martin Luther King's main teachers. Matter of fact, Martin Luther King took 34 credit hours and learned a lot of what became this nonviolent movement from him. And of course, Mohandas Gandhi and the Bible. And Martin Luther King was as attracted to the Hebrew Bible as he was to the Christian Bible because of the sense of justice and criticism. So here's Ira Zepp, who's got his library, and he says, I'm going into Martin Luther King's library, and I'm going to find out how his mind got shaped, what he read, and what he cared about. Now let me step away for a second. Is this on? But let me step away for a second and talk about, again, with you teachers in mind, I want to talk about this notion of mentors. Because what I'm trying to point out to the teachers and the students here is what it means to really encounter a library, a book. And I'm pointing to a man named Arthur Kleinman here. One of the things that happened to me after I had this great experience here with Ira Zepp is every university I went to, I always looked for a mentor. And this is what you need to do. You need to look for a mentor. I looked for somebody on the campus who was more experienced than me, who knew the campus politics, and who had a heart like Ira Zepp. So I went to the University of Colorado, and I found a guy named Jack Kelso. And Jack Kelso became my mentor. And whenever I had questions, either about issues with students, issues with other faculty, issues with politics, I went to Kelso, and Kelso helped me out. Matter of fact, he gave me a good piece of advice. He said, look, whenever you go to anybody in the hierarchy above you, wherever you go for, always ask them for advice first. Say, I came to ask for advice, but I do want some money from you too. And when I went to Princeton University, it was Toni Morrison, the African-American novelist. How many of you have read Toni Morrison in this room? So I went to Toni Morrison, and Toni Morrison became my mentor at Princeton. And we began to work together, we traveled together, but I always went to her whenever I thought I might be in trouble or where I needed to make a turn in something. And when I went to Harvard, I found this man, Arthur Kleinman. His name is Arthur Kleinman. He's a medical anthropologist. He's a great medical anthropologist, and his whole career as a doctor and as an anthropologist has been dedicated to encouraging students, no matter what they're studying, to be caregivers. If you're a lawyer, be a caregiver. If you're a businessman, be a caregiver. If you're going to go into anthropology, be a caregiver. Care for somebody. He said, because if you want to know what wisdom is, it's caring for other people. That's where you'll find the wisdom. But he says something very important about this, Arthur Kleinman. Here he is. I like this. It was a cartoon of him as a medical doctor. He said, what you need to do if you're going to go into the library, if you're going to go to school, he says, you got to find what he calls an interlocutor. You got to find somebody who you're going to read, and you're going to read them deep. and you're going to read them wide. And you read this interlocutor, and you read these people until you find somebody, and I love this phrase, who's going to come right down into your life and illuminate it from within. He says, that's an interlocutor. That's a teacher. They come right down into your life, and they illuminate it from within. And that's what Ira Zepp was, and that's what he was looking for. I like that. There goes William James. His interlocutor was William James. My interlocutor was Ira Zepp. Ira Zepp's interlocutor was not only Jesus, but Martin Luther King. And the deeper he got into it, King became Zepp's interlocutor, and Zepp learns that King had combined library along with black church experience to make a devotion, and King's devotion was to the realization of the beloved community. That was his primary goal. Subsequently, Zepp's devotion was to an education through prayer, teaching, scholarship, nonviolent action, to realize some sense, some periodic experiences of the beloved community right here on this hill, right here on this hill. Now, Zepp is doing this as he's allowing Martin Luther King to come right down into, as a matter of fact, what he does is he writes this incredible dissertation. Here's the dissertation. And it's one of the best dissertations I've ever read. He writes this dissertation, and what he does is he discovers that the key was nonviolence. But here's the question, taking you deeper into the library. Where did King get this nonviolence? Zepp tells us. In part, Martin Luther King, in his library was Mohandas Gandhi. That's where he got the notion of nonviolence in part. Gandhi was King's interlocutor, got right down into his life and illuminated it from within. If you want to talk about being a teacher, that's what you have to get after. Now, where did King first hear about Mohandas Gandhi? He heard about it from this man, Mordecai Johnson, the first black president of Howard University. This man had just returned from India, and he came to his theological school. And this is what King says. He says, the message was so profound and electrifying about Gandhi, I left the meeting and bought 6 books of Gandhi's life and work. This is what Zepp is discovering about King's library. And then what he does is he goes into Gandhi's library. So Zepp then went into Gandhi's library and asked the question, who influenced Gandhi's nonviolent approach? You see, this is Ira Zepp. He's not taking a nationalist position. He's not just saying, I'm just going to read German theologians. He's not just saying, I'm going to read African-American voices. He's not just saying, I'm going to read Latinos. No. He's, I'm going to read all these cats. And what are all these cats saying? They're saying, hey, man, the truth is our library was multicultural, multiracial, and in some cases had women in them too. So where did Gandhi get his idea? The Bhagavad Gita. That's where he got his idea. He got it from the Song of the Lord, this great ancient tradition in India. He got it from somebody named John Ruskin. This is Gandhi reading the book called Unto the Last. He said it put a magic spell on Gandhi, Gandhi says. He read Leo Tolstoy, who wrote a book, The Kingdom of God is Within You. Gandhi read Thoreau. He read the Sermon on the Mount. You see, education is not really racial. Education cannot just be racial or ethnic. It just cannot be in terms of gender single things. This is what Zepp is finding out in this dissertation. So the result is this dissertation. Now check this out. This comes out in 1971. It's called The Social Vision of Martin Luther King Jr. Right here on this campus. Hardly anybody paid attention on the campus. But other people paid attention because 18 years later, this dissertation gets published by the leading historian of the African-American movement in this country, David Garrow. And this is what David Garrow says. He won the Pulitzer Prize. He talks about Ira Zepp's book. He said it's the most valuable and useful study of the written influence upon King yet completed. This means 18 years later, after, say, 1971. A crucial piece of analysis that each and every serious student of Martin Luther King Jr. ought to be familiar with stands head and shoulders above the crowd in appreciating and reflecting the intellectual complexity and richness that helped produce the ethical and social thinking of Martin Luther King Jr. little farm boy coming out of Carroll County. Check it out. But here's what happens. Shows you the spirit of Ira Zepp. It gets turned into this book. But it gets turned into this book that's published with Kenneth Smith and Ira Zepp. Kenneth Smith happened to be one of King's teachers. So Ira Zepp goes to Kenneth Smith and says, hey, I want to publish, how about you and I? Yeah, let's do it. He does it. They publish this book. All right? This book comes out with fanfare, and it's on the Today Show. Now, nobody else at Western Maryland College at that time was publishing anything that came out on the Today Show. And they decided that Kenneth Smith should be the one to go on the Today Show because he was the senior cat, and he was the teacher. And before he went on the Today Show, Ira Zepp only asked him to do one thing. You know what it was? He said, please, when you're on the Today Show, just mention Western Maryland College. Just please mention, Ira Zepp at Western Maryland College. And he didn't do it. Didn't do it. But that's where Ira was. You see, Ira was about the hill. Ira was about this place. So that's the first theme. I'm going to go faster through these next two. Remember, he had three themes. The second theme was the multicultural that you've already seen. And here he benefits greatly by a colleague on the campus named Earl Griswold, whose widow is here with us tonight. Let's give her a round of applause for sticking with Earl Griswold through the years. Earl Griswold is an anthropologist. He knows all about Herskovits. He knows all about this multicultural thing. He helps Zepp expand himself. And what happens on the campus, the two of them put together a number of student opportunities, organizations. But here's the key thing for my school teacher friends that we met today in the Search for Common Ground. We talk about multicultural. Multicultural is good. I'm down with multicultural. Harvard, they're all up about it, multicultural. As a matter of fact, England even had some multicultural. But multicultural is not the goal. The goal is inclusion, which is not the same as multicultural. Multicultural's got to become inclusion. And this is what Ira Zepp was about, and this was what Earl Griswold was about. So what they did is they put together the Student Opportunity Service, Operation Hinge, and here you see Earl Griswold with his camera and Ira Zepp working with these student organizations. Now, as an expression of this part of Ira Zepp, what does he do? He goes to India. And when he goes to India, not only does he get turned on to Gandhi, he gets turned on to this voice, Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore wins the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1912, and he becomes this great international voice. And here you see him. You see him as this young kind of great guru, and here he is also with Gandhi much later in life. And Ira Zepp becomes fascinated with Tagore, and he becomes fascinated with Tagore, first of all, because what he sees in Tagore, he sees in Tagore is the notion of the ferryman. The ferryman is the person that carries you from one shore to another shore. And earlier on in that book of Ira's autobiography, one of the things he says is that he learned there on the farm that a bridge, in order for it to be effective, had to touch both shores. See, some people just think about bridges as you're crossing the bridge, but you don't think about the shores, the people on both sides. And Tagore was all about respecting things on both sides, cultures on both sides of the bridge. He said you had to be able to respect people on this side and that side. And Ira Zepp liked this idea of touching the sides of the river, the east and the west, even before people were talking about the east and the west. He said you have to be able to learn and respect these different worldviews. But he also liked the fact that Tagore was dialoguing with Gandhi about nonviolence, because one of the things that you see in Zepp's life later on, especially in his relationship with Charles Collier and others, how much he has to think through nonviolence. Nonviolence is a hard thing. Nonviolence is not just being nice to your people, your neighbors. It's about people who are your enemies. And so Ira Zepp thinks through nonviolence, and he thinks it through this way. This is part of his notion. Here you see the book that he and Charles Collier did, Ira G. Zepp and Collier, Nonviolence, Origins of Outcomes. Not only that, if that's not enough for this, Ira Zepp was on this hill. He does this book, A Muslim Primer, which becomes a kind of bestseller. He does this 20 years ago because he was upset about the wars, and he was upset about the fact that Muslims were being stereotyped so strongly in this culture. That stereotypes were so bad. And he said, people don't know about Islam. They don't know about the Muslims. So he goes and learns as much as he can, and he writes a beginner's guide. And you know the criticisms he's gotten for this? The criticisms he's gotten for people that say, man, he doesn't talk about the bad parts of Islam. He doesn't talk about all the negatives in Islam, you know. These people, would they talk about the negatives in Christianity? Would they talk about the negatives in Judaism? But there's Ira Zepp. Not only that, this is really amazing about Ira Zepp, is he starts thinking about people in Carroll County. And he wants to be more inclusive of the people in Carroll County, many of them who've been against him. And so what does he do? He does a little book called The Sacred Spaces of Westminster. And he goes around Westminster and he finds all these parks and these designs and these little places where people have built kind of walkways and parks and designs, and he realizes there's a sense of sacrality even here in Westminster. And then he goes and he does this story about malls, because he sees the malls and he goes into the malls and he doesn't just see business. He sees human beings there, and he sees the designs of the mall, and he begins to think there's a religious tinge even to this. And then one of the things he does is he turns his efforts really back to this campus again. And he begins to work with people like Pam Zappardino and Charles Collier and Walt Michael. And they begin to develop together in numerous ways the kinds of institutions that are here to carry on the legacy of someone like Ira Zepp. I love this picture of Walt and Ira. I call it dreaming up common ground on the hill together. Because here diversity becomes inclusion under the influence of someone like Ira Zepp. Diversity becomes inclusion, and very much what you're involved in. Now I want to return to the hill. Return to the hill. Now why did he stay on the hill? Well, I think one of the reasons he stayed on the hill was because on this particular hill, unlike that particular hill, he could be all over the hill. You know, he was down here on this street, Union Street. He was on all levels of the hill, and he could preach on the top of the hill. And he could be with students all over the hill. And by doing that, he was overcoming, in a sense, what happened to him on that hill back there as a child. Now, as a Mexican-American who studies ancient religions, let me just add one more thing about the hill, and then I'll get to the last theme in Zepp's life. See, one of the things that always impressed me about him and this hill is that he never left the hill. Now, in Mexico and all over the world where indigenous people are, they have special relationships to hills. And the reason that they got special relationships to the hills is because in many of these cultures, they believe that the ancestors go to live inside the hill. Not only did they go and live inside the hill, the ancestors guard something while they're living inside the hill. And what they guard are the seeds. The seeds not only of agriculture, but the seeds of human life. In Mexico, the Indians call it the corazones. They guard the hearts that are inside the hill. As a matter of fact, the ancestors who live inside the hill, they're called the hearts of the hill. So for me, Ira Zepp is the heart of this hill. He's never left the hill. And that's why you can see him in Common Ground and the mural and the plaza and the Zepp Center. So his library was always up here on this hill. And it seems to me that you see this most powerfully, and I'm coming to the end, in the third theme that I think we have to end with in terms of Ira Zepp, prayer as access to transcendence and common ground. Now, one of the books that he did is called Prayer as Ballast, Rudder, and Sail. And he asked me to write the introduction to this book. Now, the first time he did the book, he called it Prayer as Ballast and Rudder. And some friend came to him and said, man, you've never sailed anything in your life, because you can't sail without a sail. So I read in the second edition, he said, oops, it's Prayer as Ballast, Rudder, and Sail, is what he said. And he's got all these wonderful prayers. Including a prayer for common ground on the hill. Let me read it to you. Gracious God, you're the source of our unity as a human family and our common ground, because you made of one blood all the nations of the earth. We owe our oneness, unity, and wholeness to your marvelous creation. We joyfully and gratefully gather from time to time to celebrate the rich artistic tapestry of our various crafts, our diverse, divine, and seamless garment of colors, races, ethnicities, ages, and classes, and do this in an atmosphere of mutual respect, friendship, acceptance. As a result of teaching, studying, and participating in music, art, dance, and other creative forms of expressions, we ask you to help us have less suspicion and more trust, less separation and more unity, less hurt and more healing, less fractured community and more beloved community, less monologue and more dialogue, less deceit and more honesty, less issues about turf and more about the sky, less oppression and more justice, less alienation and more reconciliation, less knothole and more panorama, less pride and more humility, so we can return to that place where the paint is mixed that colors the world, to that rehearsal room where our instruments are tuned to harmonize our lives. And then, following our common human thread, we make our pilgrimage to that original common ground where we all finally stand by virtue of your love and mercy and our willingness to love and understand each other. This was Ira Zepp with Mary Zepp, his beloved wife, who also did so much for all of us here on this campus. So when the student is ready, the teacher will appear. And Ira Zepp appeared for me. He appeared for many of you. I hope tonight he's appeared for those of you who never saw him. And I want you to know I believe that because of you, and especially things like Common Ground on the Hill and the Mary and Ira Zepp Center for Nonviolence and Justice and Peace, that he's still here. Thank you.
Well, David, that was a home run. I'm sure they're probably, yeah. And there are probably people who would like to ask some questions. So, we open it up. Don't go anywhere.
Here you go, here you go. Here you go.
Thanks. I just wanted to say to David, thank you for the talk. My relationship with Ira was as friend and student of his, and I think, to use your term, he was my interlocutor. At the last day of that class, I walked with tears streaming down my face to one of the big trees back on the back part of campus here, and I sat there, and I kid you not, for 2 hours with nothing I could do but cry. And he had completely rearranged my thinking and my life and everything, and he has everything to do with why I'm still here at Common Ground on the Hill. And I want to say a special thanks, and like David has said, to the teachers who are here tonight. I think I've had some experience as a teacher teaching foreign language, teaching English as a foreign language overseas, and what I got really good at doing that was kind of the micro part of teaching. But the macro part of teaching that Ira showed me by his example has always been with me too, and I hope that you all take something away from tonight. And I'd just like to say in front of everybody that I'm one person who's ready to continue that work, and despite his request, I miss him.
Anyone else? Anyone else? Anyone else? Let me just conclude with one last story that goes along. So, in the week before Ira passed, Walt and I went to the hospital to see him, and I knew this was our goodbye. And so I spent some time with him. And while I was in the room with him, two things happened that really stuck with me. The first was he was in pain, and a nurse came in to help him. And what she did was she reached over and touched him and rearranged him a little bit in the bed. And when she left, he said, "Tenderness is a good thing when death is near." And he just looked at me. And then the last thing I want to say is that we were in the room, and he was medicated, and he was suffering, and he was doing his best. And over on the wall in front of him, there just happened to be an empty container that had some unusual shapes. You could say were like two heads. He looked over and he said, "Is that Martin Luther King and Gandhi?" No. And I looked over and saw what it was, and we just were sat there in silence. So I want to say that I hope all of you just have a fabulous week here at Common Ground on the Hill.